In this video, I want to introduce the major reproductive structures in women. Here you're looking at a posterior view of the female reproductive structures, kind of in isolation, so as though they'd been extracted from the abdominopelvic cavity. You have the uterus in the center. The uterus is the womb. This is the organ that houses and nourishes the fertilized ovum, the fertilized egg, and the developing embryo until birth. You also have the vagina. The vagina is both the female copulatory organ and the birth canal, so it's dual purpose. It is the means by which sperm gets delivered into the female reproductive tract, and the pathway by which birth typically happens. Then you have the ovaries. The ovaries are the female analog of the male testes. These are the organs that form the female gamete, the ovum. The ovaries are connected to the uterine tube, otherwise known as the fallopian tube, which provides a passageway for eggs released from the ovary to move down to the uterus. If you look at the female reproductive structures in sagittal view, actually in the body, this is what they look like. You've got the uterus here, the vagina, the cervix, which is basically the base of the uterus. You have the ovaries. Of course, you're only seeing one here. The other one's been cut away to show the uterus in sagittal view. And then you have the uterine tubes. Note that the uterus is a highly muscular organ. It has a much thicker muscular wall than the urinary bladder. Here you're looking at a histological view of the wall of the uterus. It has three distinct layers. You have the myometrium. Remember the prefix myo means muscle, so the myometrium is the muscular layer of the uterus. This is the muscle that contracts during labor to expel the baby through the birth canal, the vagina. Superficial to the myometrium, you have the endometrium. The endometrium is the functional wall of the uterus. So the myometrium is the muscular wall, the endometrium is the internal wall of the uterus, and there are two layers or strata of the endometrium. The stratum basalis is the base, basalis base of the endometrium. This layer of the endometrium is continually present. This layer of the endometrium is always there. The stratum functionalis, the innermost layer, the layer that is closest to that lines the lumen of the uterus, this is the layer of the endometrium that's shed during menstruation. This is an image of that. This is what the uterine wall looks like during menstruation. You can see the myometrium, you can see the stratum basalis, and then the stratum functionalis coming off of the uterine wall. The stratum functionalis is the functional layer of the endometrium. It contains these deep glands called uterine glands, and these uterine glands, they're also called endometrial glands. They nourish and support the pregnancy during the first trimester, before the placenta is fully functioning. See, during the final 6 months of pregnancy, the placenta is the source of nourishment for the developing fetus. There's exchange of blood at the placenta so that the fetus can acquire nutrients from the mother's blood. But maternal circulation to the placenta isn't fully established until about 10 to 12 weeks after conception, after the baby's conceived. So up until that point, the endometrial glands, these uterine glands, these are what are responsible for nourishing that developing embryo. They secrete glycogen, which can be broken down to glucose and used for energy. They also secrete growth factors that promote growth and development of the embryo. Attached to the uterus, you have two uterine tubes, also known as fallopian tubes. You may hear both terms. the fallopian tubes receive the oocyte that's released during ovulation. So the oocyte's released from the ovary. These fimbriae are these sort of finger-like extensions of the uterine tube that help guide the oocyte into the tube. There's actually no direct connection between the ovary and the uterine tube. There's just this little bit of space between the two, and the fimbriae, which form sort of like a funnel, guiding the oocyte in. This is a clinically significant anatomical feature because this lack of direct connection means that in women, STDs can lead to infection in the pelvic cavity. Because if you have a really florid bacterial infection, some of those bacteria can actually escape out of the opening between the uterine tube and the ovary and infect the pelvic cavity, lead to pelvic infection. It's called pelvic inflammatory disease, PID. This anatomical anomaly is also why you can sometimes get an ectopic pregnancy happening in the abdominal cavity. Now, normally, if an egg is fertilized, that fertilized ovum implants in the uterus and develops in the uterus. An ectopic pregnancy, and I'll just spell that out, that refers to any pregnancy in which the embryo implants somewhere other than the uterus. The uterine tube is the most common location, but on very rare occasions, that fertilized ovum escapes out of the space between the ovary and the fimbriae and implants in the abdomen. There have actually been a couple of people, that have been able to carry a baby and give birth to a live baby that has implanted in the abdominal cavity. As long as that baby gets a good source of blood, it can establish a placenta. It's very, very dangerous, though, because the abdominal wall is not designed to support, hasn't evolved to support a developing fetus. So it's very dangerous to both the fetus and the mom, but with very careful medical oversight, there have been successful births. Of course, they'd have to be delivered by C-section. But I digress a bit. The fallopian tubes themselves have this highly folded mucosa. That's what you're seeing here, highly, highly folded. There is also some ciliated cells. You can see this is basically zooming in on one of those folds of the mucosa of the fallopian tube, and you can see the cilia there. The cilia beat. They set up a current that helps move the oocyte towards the uterus. So the fimbriae act like the funnel that kind of help guides an oocyte into the uterine tube, and then the beating of the cilia sets up a current that moves the oocyte down into the uterus. This funnel portion of the uterine tube is referred to as the infundibulum, leads into the ampulla, the middle region, and then the isthmus, which connects to the uterus. It takes about 3 or 4 days for an oocyte to travel from the ovary to the uterus. If that egg is going to become fertilized, it must encounter sperm during the first 12 to 24 hours after release. So fertilization typically occurs in the fallopian tube. Fertilization actually occurs in the fallopian tube, typically, and then the fertilized egg travels down to the uterus and implants in the endometrium. The ovaries are the sites of gamete formation in women. This is where the female gamete is formed, the female oocyte, which can mature into an ovum if it gets fertilized. The ovaries release a single mature oocyte each month. That's the process of ovulation. So each ovary, typically, you have several oocytes developing, but then only one oocyte released. And it may alternate, it may come from the right ovary 1 month, the left ovary the next month, or it may come from the same ovary twice. But usually it's just one oocyte released each month. Of course, if you have multiple oocytes released, like two oocytes released at once and both of them get fertilized, that's where you have something like fraternal twins occurring. The ovaries are also endocrine organs, just like the testes are endocrine organs in males. In males, the testes produce testosterone and other androgens. In females, the ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone. We'll talk about that a bit more when we talk about the female reproductive physiology. Now, you may have heard that a woman is born with all of her oocytes, and that is pretty much true. The oocytes develop in little pockets in the ovary referred to as follicles. And primordial follicles with immature oocytes are all formed by birth. And then they go into basically a form of stasis. They don't progress, they just kind of sit there and wait until you get the hormonal surges of puberty. Then these follicles start maturing and the oocytes start progressing. Okay, so after studying this video, it's just a quick introduction to female reproduction. We'll get into more detail with the physiology video. But you should be able to identify major organs and structures and talk a little bit about their functions. So the ovaries, the uterine tubes, the uterus. You should be able to trace the pathway an ovum takes from ovulation to implantation in the uterine wall. If it's fertilized, if it's not fertilized, it's simply swept out. It's swept out of the uterus. You should also be able to answer this question: where does fertilization usually take place? You should be able to describe the structure of the uterine wall, the two layers of the endometrium and the myometrium. And you should be able to talk about what happens to the endometrium during menstruation.